Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're telling a story about the massive difference between knowing the job on paper and living it in your bones. If you're ready for an incredible story of justice and vindication, hit like, subscribe, and get ready to comment your reaction, because this one is a wild ride. Our story is called The Blueprint of a Soul. It's about a cocky young architect who nearly destroys his father's legacy, and the quiet carpenter he belittled every single day, who just so happened to be a secret architectural genius. You know, I've always believed that steel and wood don't lie. You can talk all day about theories and designs, but at the end of it all, a joint either holds or it doesn't. A beam is either level or it's not. There's a simple, brutal honesty to it that I've respected for 45 years. It's the people who are complicated. The people lie. I learned that lesson the hard way, especially on the job site of the Elysian Tower. I was the lead carpenter there, just a guy with a worn leather tool belt and hands that looked like a roadmap of every project I'd ever bled for. To the head office, to the young architects in their spotless boots, I was just part of the machinery. An old, reliable, but ultimately replaceable part. And no one made me feel that more than Caleb Sterling. He was the son of the firm's founder. A kid barely 28 years old who inherited a legend's name but none of his grit. He'd walk onto the 45th floor, the Chicago wind whipping around the steel skeleton of the tower, and he wouldn't see the sweat and the skill. He'd only see delays on his precious schedule. That morning was no different. He was standing there with Frank, our site foreman, jabbing a manicured finger at a tablet displaying the blueprints. "I need this entire section reframed by tomorrow. Frank, the investors are coming for a walkthrough," he said, his voice sharp and brittle, cutting through the noise of grinding metal. I was nearby, checking the seating of a primary support beam, and I could hear the exhaustion in Frank's voice. "Caleb, my guys are stretched thin. That's a 2-day job minimum. We push this, mistakes happen." Caleb finally looked up from his screen, and the look he gave Frank was one I'd seen 1,000 times. It was that bored, impatient look that a man gives to a tool that isn't working right. "Mistakes happen when people are inefficient, Frank. Not when they're managed properly. Get it done." He then turned his gaze on me. I was running my hand along the surface of a laminated veneer lumber beam, feeling for imperfections. "My touch is more accurate than any sensor they've got. And you, Eli," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "make sure your guys aren't taking any extra coffee breaks. We're not paying you to reminisce about the good old days." He smirked, a tight, unpleasant little curl of his lips. A couple of the younger guys on the crew snickered. I didn't say a word. I just gave a slow, deliberate nod. In this line of work, you learn to swallow your pride like you swallow sawdust. It's bitter, but it's part of the job. But as Caleb turned away, preening in his own authority, my eyes lingered on the glowing blueprint on his tablet. The section he was so desperate to rush. What he didn't know, what no one on that entire site knew, was that I probably understood those blueprints better than he did. I wasn't just a carpenter. I'd spent 45 years not just building, but studying the very soul of buildings. And I saw something on his perfect digital plan, a tiny detail, a subtle miscalculation in the load distribution for the western curtain wall, the one that would bear the full force of the wind off Lake Michigan. It was a small thing, a ghost in the machine that only a lifetime of experience could spot. It wasn't a problem yet, but I knew, with the certainty of a man who knows how buildings breathe and how they break, that if they kept pushing, that little ghost would soon become a monster. And Caleb, in his blind arrogance, was rushing headfirst into its arms. I just took a slow sip of lukewarm coffee from my dented thermos and went back to work. Patience, I told myself. Wood and steel have it. So do I. The lunch bell screamed at noon, a sound that sliced right through the racket of the site. It was the one moment of the day that was truly ours. The younger guys would whip out their phones, scrolling through whatever nonsense the world was feeding them. But for the older crew, for guys like me and Frank, it was a ritual. You find a patch of shade, you pop open the metal lunch pail your wife packed for you that morning, and for 30 minutes you're not just a number on a payroll. You're a man eating a sandwich. That day, I found a quiet spot behind a stack of drywall, the city noise muffled just enough for me to hear my own thoughts. And my thoughts, well, they weren't on the dry turkey sandwich in my hands. They were on that blueprint, on that tiny hairline fracture in Caleb's perfect digital world. After I finished eating, I did something I rarely did out in the open. I reached into my worn canvas bag and pulled out a leather-bound book. It wasn't big, about the size of a Bible, and the leather was softened and stained from years of calloused hands opening it. It didn't have a title, it didn't need one. This book was my real life's work. I opened it, and the smell of old paper and graphite filled the air. Inside there were no words, just drawings, page after page of them, rendered in painstakingly precise pencil strokes. Designs for cantilevered balconies that seemed to float on air, schematics for geothermal heating systems, and detailed cross-sections of buildings that looked more like living organisms than structures of concrete and steel. These weren't just doodles. They were fully realized architectural plans, complete with stress calculations and material specifications, scribbled in the margins in my clean, blocky handwriting. This was the ghost in my machine. The architect I was supposed to be, tucked away in a book no one ever saw. I was sketching a new idea, a modification for a wind-bracing system, when a shadow fell over the page. I looked up. It was Frank. He was holding his own empty lunchbox, his expression unreadable. For a second, I felt a flash of panic, like a kid caught doing something he shouldn't. I started to close the book. "Don't," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Let me see." He wasn't demanding, just curious. I hesitated, then slowly turned the book so he could see the page. He leaned in, his eyes sharp and intelligent despite the crow's feet. Scanning the drawing, he was quiet for a long time. "That's for the sway, right? For the high winds," I just nodded. He pointed a thick finger at a specific joint I'd drawn. "You're using a pin and hanger assembly here. Smarter. Allows for more temperature expansion than the fixed joint on the official plan." He knew. He didn't have the technical language maybe, but he'd been on the job long enough to recognize elegant design when he saw it. He looked from the book to my face, and then back to the book. "You ever show these to anyone?" he asked quietly. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, a memory from 20 years ago surfacing. I remembered standing in this very same office trailer, showing a younger, healthier Arthur Sterling, Caleb's father, a similar book. Arthur had been a real builder, a man who respected the craft. He'd looked through my designs with genuine admiration. "Eli, these are brilliant," he'd said, his voice full of warmth. "Truly, you have the soul of an architect." I'd felt a surge of hope so powerful it almost knocked me off my feet. But then he'd clapped me on the shoulder, handed the book back and said, "But you're the best damn carpenter I've ever seen. You're more valuable to me with a hammer in your hand than a pencil." It wasn't meant to be cruel. It was just business. But it was in that moment I understood my place. A brilliant carpenter. But a carpenter, nonetheless. "Once," I finally said to Frank, my voice raspy. "A long time ago." Frank just grunted, a sound of understanding. He knew the politics of this place. He knew about the lines you don't cross. He looked over his shoulder toward the office trailer, where Caleb was probably eating a catered lunch off a real plate. "That kid's gonna run this project into the ground," he muttered. More to himself than to me. "He doesn't listen, he just commands." He straightened up, handing the book back to me carefully, like it was something precious. "You keep drawing, Eli," he said. "A man's gotta keep his soul alive somehow." He walked away, without another word. The lunch bell shrieked again, signaling the end of our 30 minutes of peace. I carefully closed my leather book, the world of elegant solutions and beautiful designs vanishing between its covers. As I stood up, my joints protesting. For the next week, a strange kind of quiet fell over the site. It was the quiet of a crew being pushed too hard, too fast. Frank got his way, sort of. Caleb's one-day deadline for the reframing turned into 3, but it was a rushed, sloppy job, and we all knew it. We hit our marks, but the work felt hollow. There's a rhythm to a good construction site, a hum of controlled chaos where every man knows his part. That rhythm was gone. It was replaced by a nervous energy, the feeling of just trying to keep your head above water. I kept my head down and my mouth shut, but I watched. I watched the way the new support joints on the western face settled under the morning load, and I didn't like what I saw. It was a subtle thing, a tremor you felt more in the soles of your feet than you could see with your eyes, but it was there. The building was groaning. It was a storm gathering on the horizon, and it had a name. Kato Tanaka. Tanaka. Heavy Industries wasn't just the primary investor. They were co-developers. These weren't some Wall Street guys who only looked at spreadsheets. These were engineers. The Japanese firm was legendary for its precision work on skyscrapers and earthquake zones. They didn't just build structures. They built monuments to safety and efficiency. And their lead engineer, Mr. Tanaka himself, was coming for his final inspection before signing off on the next phase of funding, a check that accounted for about half the project's budget. The day he was scheduled to arrive, the entire site transformed. Caleb had crews scrubbing dirt off walkways that would be covered in concrete the next day. He even had them power wash the crane. It was a dog and pony show, a desperate attempt to sell an image of perfection. For a man who inherited a legacy of substance, Caleb was obsessed with style. When they arrived, it was like a scene out of a movie. A fleet of Blacktown cars pulled up, and out stepped Mr. Tanaka and his team. They were all older, dressed in simple, dark suits, their movements economical and precise. They didn't look at the spectacle. They looked at the details. Mr. Tanaka's gaze swept over the base of the tower, and I could swear, even from 50 yards away, that he was noticing the barely visible stress lines in the foundation concrete. Caleb met them with a smile so wide it looked painful, launching into a loud, over-rehearsed speech about synergy and cutting-edge design. Mr. Tanaka just gave a slight bow, his face a polite, unreadable mask. I was tasked with installing window frames on the 46th floor, just one level above the conference room where Caleb was giving his big presentation. I couldn't hear everything, but the low murmur of voices drifted up through the floor vents. I was working, trying to ignore the show downstairs, when I heard Caleb's voice rise, full of false confidence, followed by a different voice, speaking perfect English with a distinct Japanese accent. It was Tanaka. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that Caleb's lacked. It was the sound of true authority. Later, Frank told me what happened. Caleb was showing off the 3D rendering on a massive touchscreen, a flashy animation of the completed tower. It was all marketing fluff. Then, Tanaka had asked a question. It was simple, direct, and utterly lethal. "Mr. Sterling," he'd said, his voice cutting through the bullshit, "your design specifies a standard curtain wall assembly for the western face. Given Chicago's notorious vortex shedding effect at this altitude, what specific non-linear dampening measures have you integrated to counter harmonic resonance?" Frank said you could have heard a pin drop. It was a highly technical question. A real architect, a man like Arthur Sterling, would have relished it. Caleb just blinked. He tried to bluff, rambling about proprietary algorithms and next-gen materials. Tanaka didn't press him. He just gave a small thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. He already had his answer. Right at that moment, as if on cue, Frank had walked in. He looked pale. "Caleb," he'd said, trying to keep his voice low, "we've got an anomalous reading. Strain gauge on beam 77B, west face. It's showing a micro-oscillation pattern that's way outside tolerance." It was the tremor I'd been feeling. It was the building telling us it was in pain. Caleb's face went white, then red with fury and embarrassment. In front of the most important investor, his foreman had... You'd think after a visit like that, after seeing the look on Kato Tanaka's face, a man would pump the brakes. You'd think he'd call in his senior engineers, spread the blueprints across a real table, not a fancy touchscreen, and start asking the hard questions. That's what his father would have done. But Caleb wasn't his father. The day after the Japanese delegation left, a strange and toxic silence descended on the Elysian Tower. Caleb was suddenly a ghost. He stopped walking the site. Instead, he stayed locked in his climate-controlled trailer, a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the chaos he was supposed to be managing. We'd just catch glimpses of him, pacing back and forth on the phone, his face pale and tight. The rumor mill on a construction site runs faster than any news ticker, and the story was that the Tanaka deal was on life support. The money had been frozen. The project was bleeding. Instead of facing the problem, Caleb tried to bury it in paperwork. A memo went out to all crew leaders. It was a masterpiece of corporate double talk, full of phrases like proactively recalibrating our sensor arrays and performing a routine diagnostic to optimize structural harmony. It was a whole lot of $10 words that meant absolutely nothing. He was trying to pretend the tremor we all felt, the groan of the building itself, was just a ghost in the machine that a simple software update could fix. He was telling us not to believe our own eyes, not to trust the intuition that guys like me and Frank had spent a lifetime earning. He was telling us the building wasn't lying, we were just imagining things. That's when I knew he wasn't just arrogant anymore. He was scared. And a scared man in charge is a dangerous man. The tremors didn't stop. That little micro-oscillation on beam 77B was becoming a low, constant hum you could feel in your teeth when you stood on the western face. It was the building talking, and it was telling us it was under a strain it was never designed to handle. 2 days after the memo, Frank came to find me during our break. His face was grim. "It's worse, Eli," he said, his voice low. "The readings are 15% over tolerance now." I told Caleb. You know what he said? He said my instruments must be faulty. He ordered me to replace the strain gauge. Replace the messenger, not listen to the message. I didn't say anything. I just pulled a small notepad and a pencil from my vest pocket. I'm not a man of many words, but I can make a pencil talk. I drew him a quick, clean diagram. Not a fancy architectural rendering, just a simple schematic showing the load-bearing points, the angle of the prevailing winds, and how the pressure wasn't distributing correctly across the joints. I pointed to the spot where the stress was concentrating. "It's not the beam, Frank," I said. "It's the design. The whole curtain wall is acting like a sail, and it's putting torque on a joint that was only meant to handle a dead load." Frank stared at my drawing, then at my face. He tucked the piece of paper carefully into his shirt pocket. He didn't ask where I learned to do that. He didn't need to. He just knew. That afternoon, he did the bravest thing I've ever seen a foreman do. He walked over to the main power feed for the western face, the section of the building that was sick, and he shut it down. He put a big, red tag on the switch that read, "Stop work order site safety violation." It was a direct challenge to Caleb's authority, a move that could have gotten him fired on the spot. But he was citing union safety regulations, and even Caleb knew that was a fight he couldn't easily win. The confrontation was short and brutal. Caleb came storming out of his trailer, his face purple with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Frank?" Frank stood his ground. "My guys don't hammer another nail into that wall until we get a certified engineer to sign off on it, Caleb. I'm not having a man's death on my conscience because you're in a hurry." Caleb looked like he was going to explode. But then, a sly, calculating look came over him. He was cornered, so he changed tactics. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "You want a second opinion? You'll get one." The next day, he announced, he was bringing in a neutral third-party engineering firm, a company called Veritas Engineering, to do a full assessment. It sounded official. It sounded responsible. But later that evening, as I was packing up my tools, I walked past his trailer. The blinds were drawn, but he was on the phone, his voice sharp and clear in the quiet evening air. "Look, Donnie," he was saying, "I don't need a dissertation. I just need a report that says the oscillations are within acceptable parametric tolerances. Give me the piece of paper that makes the union happy and makes my investors shut up. We all get paid. Simple." My blood ran cold. Veritas Engineering wasn't a third party. It was a rubber stamp. He wasn't trying to find the truth. He was trying to buy it. The first real crack had appeared in the illusion. The boys from Veritas Engineering were a real piece of work. They spent 2 days on site and maybe 30 minutes outside of Caleb's trailer. They walked around with fancy-looking instruments, took a few readings that looked important, and spent the rest of the time drinking the expensive coffee Caleb had catered for them. It was a joke. We all knew it. They weren't there to find a problem. They were there to certify its absence. 2 days later, a thick, glossy report with the Veritas logo landed on Caleb's desk. I saw it through the trailer window. It looked heavy. Official. It was full of charts and technical jargon, but I knew it was lighter than air. It was a document born of a lie, and it wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. But for Caleb, that report was a royal flush. It was his get-out-of-jail-free card, and he couldn't wait to play it. The next morning, he called a mandatory, all-hands safety meeting at the base of the tower. Every single one of us, from the crane operators to the apprentices, had to be there. He stood on a makeshift stage of stacked pallets, holding that glossy report like a king holding his scepter. His old arrogance was back, but this time it was sharpened with a nasty, vindictive edge. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice booming over a portable speaker system. "I know there have been some concerns recently." He let the word hang in the air, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Frank, who stood beside me, his arms crossed, his face like granite. "I want to thank you for your patience," Caleb continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "It's important to trust the process. It's important to trust the experts, and not get carried away by unfounded speculation." He was lecturing us, a crew of men who had forgotten more about building than he would ever know. "I have here the full, independent report from Veritas Engineering. They have concluded, after a thorough analysis, that the structure is not only sound but exceeds all industry safety standards. The sensor readings were, as I suspected, a calibration error." He held up the report for all to see. It was his moment of triumph, his chance to publicly humiliate Frank and put us all back in our place. He was just about to announce the immediate resumption of work on the western face when a quiet hum interrupted him. It was the sound of expensive engines. 3 Blacktown cars had pulled up to the curb, silent as sharks. The whole crew, all 200 of us, turned to look. The doors opened, and out stepped Mr. Kato Tanaka. He wasn't alone. Beside him was an older, sterner-looking man, and a team of 2 younger engineers who moved with swift, silent purpose. The air went dead still. Caleb froze mid-sentence, the triumphant smile melting off his face, replaced by a look of pure, slack-jawed shock. Mr. Tanaka didn't even look at him. His eyes were fixed on the western face of the tower, cold and hard as a diamond. He gave a short, sharp nod to his team. They didn't ask for permission. They opened the trunk of one of the cars and began assembling a sleek, tripod-mounted device. It looked like something out of a science fiction movie. A high-precision, long-range laser scanner, Mr. Tanaka. What a surprise, Caleb stammered, scrambling down from his pallet stage. We were just finishing a safety briefing. As you can see from this report, Mr. Tanaka held up a single silencing hand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. We are here to conduct our own analysis, Mr. Sterling, he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. With our own instruments. While Caleb stood there, utterly powerless, Tanaka's team aimed the laser at beam 77B. A thin, red line, invisible to most, shot out and began scanning the structure, feeding terabytes of data back to a tablet held by the older engineer, Mr. Ishida. The contrast was brutal. Caleb was waving a piece of paper built on a lie, while Tanaka was gathering the irrefutable, physical truth in real time. What happened next was pure chaos. The moment Mr. Tanaka said the word suspended, it was like a switch flipped. The stunned silence erupted into 100 hushed, angry conversations. Men started pulling out their phones, calling their wives, their union reps. You could feel the panic rippling through the crowd. 200 guys all thinking the same thing. Am I out of a job? How am I going to make rent? This tower wasn't just a project for us. It was a year, maybe two, of steady paychecks. It was mortgages and car payments and college funds. And it was all vanishing into thin air. Over by the trailer, Caleb was having a full-blown meltdown. He was screaming into his phone, something about lawyers and breach of contract and a hostile corporate action. He wasn't looking at the building. He wasn't looking at the men whose livelihoods he had just gambled away. He was just trying to save his own skin, blaming everyone and everything but the reflection in the mirror. I just stood there, watching it all unravel. I looked at Frank. He was standing alone, his face pale. He'd done the right thing, and his reward was likely a pink slip. I looked at the young apprentices, kids with brand new tool belts and big dreams, now staring at a future that was suddenly empty. Then I looked up. I looked past the chaos, past the fear, and I looked at the Elysian Tower. It stood silent against the gray Chicago sky, beautiful and broken, and I felt this deep, aching sense of responsibility. Not just for the men, but for the building itself. It was a magnificent idea, a testament to what we could achieve, and it was being murdered by incompetence. It deserved better. My crew deserved better. All my life I'd kept my head down. I'd followed the blueprints. I'd done my job. Arthur Sterling himself had told me my value was in my hands, not my head. For 20 years, I'd believed him. But watching Caleb screaming into his phone, I realized the terrible truth. The hands can't build what the head designs incorrectly. Something inside me just snapped. It wasn't loud. It was a quiet, cold, clean break. The fear, the years of swallowing my pride, the ghost of Arthur Sterling telling me to stay in my lane, it all just fell away. All that was left was the work, the problem, the truth. I took a deep breath, the cold air burning my lungs, and I started walking. I left the huddled group of my fellow workers and started across the open space towards the Japanese delegation. Every step felt like a mile. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes on my back. I was crossing an invisible line, leaving the world of sawdust and steel for the world of suits and contracts. I was a carpenter walking into the king's court. Mr. Tanaka saw me coming. His expression was guarded, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He probably thought I was coming to beg for my job. Before I could even open my mouth, Caleb saw me. His face, already contorted with rage, turned into a mask of pure disbelief. "You, get back with the others," he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Security. Get this man away from my investors. He's a carpenter, for God's sake." His voice was shrill, desperate. He was trying to assert an authority he no longer had. Mr. Tanaka and Mr. Ishida exchanged a quick, uncertain glance. I didn't even look at Caleb. I kept my eyes fixed on them. I stopped about 10 feet away, a respectful distance. The entire site had gone quiet again, watching this bizarre standoff. This was it, the point of no return. I cleared my throat, and my voice came out steady and clear, cutting through the tense silence. "Excuse me, sirs," I said. I waited until both Mr. Tanaka and Mr. Ishida were looking directly at me. Then I delivered the line I'd been holding inside me for a lifetime. "You are right about the metal fatigue. It is critical." I paused, letting the agreement sink in. But the oscillation isn't the disease, it's a symptom. The flaw isn't in that single beam. It's in the geometry of the entire western elevation. For a solid 10 seconds, nobody moved. It was like I'd hit the pause button on the whole world. The wind whipped dust devils around our feet, but the 200 men on that site were silent statues. It was Caleb, of course, who broke the spell. He let out a short, barking laugh that sounded more like a sob. The geometry? He sputtered, looking around for support that wasn't there. What in God's name would a hammer swinger know about structural geometry? "Frank, get your man under control. He's clearly lost his mind." But Frank didn't move. He was staring at me, his mouth slightly agape, a look of dawning wonder on his face. It wasn't Caleb who mattered anymore. The only people who mattered were the two men standing in front of me. Mr. Tanaka's face was still a mask, but his eyes had a new, intense focus. It was Mr. Ishida, the engineer, who spoke. His voice was sharp, a surgeon's scalpel. "Explain," he commanded. It wasn't a request. It was a challenge. I didn't try to explain with words. Words are cheap. I'd spent a lifetime letting my work do the talking. I turned, walked over to a nearby stack of scrap material, and pulled out a 4x8 sheet of clean plywood. It was heavy, awkward, but I leaned it against a concrete barrier where everyone could see. It was a crude canvas. I reached behind my ear and pulled out my carpenter's pencil, the flat, worn-down nub that was more a part of my hand than a tool. "Frank," I said, my voice calm, "can I borrow your T-square?" Frank fumbled in his tool belt and handed it to me, his hands shaking slightly. I placed the T-square on the board, and in that moment, something shifted. Holding that pencil, that ruler, in front of that blank piece of wood, I wasn't Eli the carpenter anymore. I was home. "The mistake," I began, my voice clear and steady, "is that you're all looking at that wall like it's a solid plank of wood you're trying to keep from breaking." My pencil flew across the plywood, sketching the current design with a speed and precision that made a few guys in the front row gasp. The lines were perfect, the angles exact. You're fighting the wind head on, but you can't fight the wind. It will always win. The wind on that face at this height doesn't just push. It creates a rhythm, a vibration. Your design is treating the western wall like a shield, but it's actually turning it into the world's biggest guitar string. I drew a series of wavy lines showing the harmonic resonance, the vibration feeding back into itself, getting stronger and stronger until the steel itself started to get tired, brittle. That's the hum we've been feeling. That's your paperclip, Mr. Ishida. You're snapping it with a rhythm. Mr. Ishida's eyes widened. He understood the analogy instantly. Caleb just looked confused, lost. "So what?" he stammered. "We add more steel? Reinforce the beams?" I shook my head, a sad slow motion. "More steel just makes the guitar string tighter. It changes the note, but it doesn't stop the music." I wiped a section of the plywood clean with my glove and started a new drawing. You don't fight the wind. You have to be smarter than the wind. You have to break its rhythm. My pencil moved with a life of its own now, sketching a complex, beautiful design. An interlocking system of smaller, independent subframes, connected by pin and hanger joints and buffered by small, viscous dampers hidden within the structure. You create a baffle, I explain, my voice filled with the passion I'd kept hidden for decades. The wind hits the first frame, and its energy is absorbed and dissipated by the first damper. What's left of the vibration is broken up and cancelled out by the next frame, and the next. It's a maze. By the time the force reaches the primary support beams, it's not a single powerful rhythm anymore. It's just noise. You're not just stopping the vibration. You're tearing it apart. I finished the drawing. It was a thing of beauty, a complex, elegant solution born on a dirty piece of plywood. The best part, I added quietly. It requires more intricate joinery, yes. More skill. But the design is so efficient, it actually uses 15% less structural steel than the current plan. It's stronger, safer, and cheaper. A stunned silence fell again. It was broken by Caleb, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. This is impossible. You can't have just come up with that. Where did you get this? This was the moment. I finally turned and looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time. There was no anger in my eyes, just a profound, weary sadness. I didn't come up with it just now, Caleb, I said, my voice soft. I presented this exact wind-baffling system to your father 17 years ago, for the Morrison Tower project. He told me it was revolutionary. He also said it was too complex for the contractors at the time, and he filed it away. I guess he forgot to tell you where he kept his best ideas. Caleb looked like I had physically struck him. He staggered back, his face ashen. The son, who had built his entire identity on his father's name, had just been told that a carpenter knew his father's work, his father's genius, better than he did. Before anyone could process that bombshell, I turned back to the Japanese engineers. I looked at Mr. Ishida, the man of science, the man of numbers. I tapped a specific set of dampers in my drawing. And then, I did the one thing I promised my late wife I would never let grow rusty. In clear, quiet, perfectly technical Japanese, I said, with this damper placement, nonlinear stress diffusion is the key. Especially at the transition point from laminar to turbulent flow. That was it. That was the final blow. The reaction was instantaneous. Caleb looked like he was going to be sick. Frank, standing behind me, had tears openly streaming down his face. The entire crew was staring at me as if I had just sprouted wings. And the Japanese delegation, for a long moment after I spoke, the only sound was the wind whistling through the steel beams. It felt like it was whistling a new tune. My Japanese words hung in the air. A final impossible fact that no one could argue with. Caleb looked like he'd been unplugged from the world. His mouth was open, but no sound was coming out. He was a statue of invalidated privilege. It was Mr. Tanaka who finally moved. He walked forward slowly, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel, until he was standing right in front of my crude plywood drawing. He didn't look at me. He looked at the lines I had drawn, his eyes tracing the flow of the design, his head tilted in deep concentration. He was no longer an investor looking at a potential loss. He was a master builder studying the work of another. He reached out a hand, not to touch the wood, but as if to feel the energy of the idea itself. He stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. Then he turned and looked at me. And in his eyes I saw the last wall of his professional skepticism crumble into dust, replaced by something I had never expected to see aimed at me in my entire life. Genuine, unadulterated awe. "Van-san," he said, the Japanese honorific slipping out naturally, a sign of deep respect. He corrected himself, switching to English for the benefit of the silent crowd watching us. "Mr. Vance, this is not just a solution. This is artistry." He gestured to the board. "You have not just fixed a flaw. You have given this building a soul." Caleb, seeing his last chance slipping away, finally found his voice. Absolutely. This is the kind of innovative thinking we at Sterling & Son encourage. Now that we have this new direction, my team can immediately— Mr. Tanaka cut him off. He didn't even look at him. He just raised his hand about an inch, a small dismissive gesture that was more brutal than a shout. It was a gesture that said, "You are no longer part of this conversation." Caleb's words died in his throat. He just stood there, a ghost at his own funeral. Mr. Tanaka's full, undivided attention was on me. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice now a partnership inquiry. "My engineer confirms your theory. The question is, can this be implemented now? Can we retrofit this design onto the existing structure without a full teardown?" The whole world had shrunk to this single question. 200 men were silent, waiting for my answer. Their jobs, this whole project, depended on it. I looked at the tower, then back at my drawing. I felt a lifetime of knowledge, of watching wood warp and steel bend, rising up inside me. "It will be difficult," I said, my voice steady. "We'd have to fabricate the subframes on the ground and lift them into place. It'll require a level of precision this crew hasn't been asked for yet, but the bones are good. Yes, it can be done." A quiet sigh of relief went through the crowd. Mr. Tanaka nodded slowly, a genuine smile finally touching his lips. He turned to Mr. Ishida. "Please," he said, gesturing to the plywood. "Secure the new blueprint." Mr. Ishida walked over and, with the help of another engineer, lifted the heavy sheet of plywood as if it were a priceless painting. They carried it toward one of their cars with a reverence that was almost comical and yet deeply moving. Then Mr. Tanaka turned back to me, his expression all business. "Mr. Vance, I am officially retaining you as the lead structural consultant for the Elysian Tower, effective immediately. Sterling & Son will remain the architects of record for contractual reasons, but you, and you alone, will have final authority on the redesign and implementation of this system. My engineers will report directly to you. Your compensation will be significant." My head was spinning. Consultant? Me? He wasn't finished. "We have wasted enough time. Is there a place where we can begin our work?" Caleb started to gesture weakly toward his glass fortress. "My office, of course, it's right." It was Frank who stepped forward, cutting him off. A proud, defiant look was on his face. He clapped me on the shoulder, a solid grounding gesture. "Right this way, Mr. Tanaka," Frank said, his voice booming with renewed authority. "We'll use my office. It's where the real work gets done anyway." And that was the moment the world truly turned upside down. The great Kato Tanaka, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire, followed Frank and me, a simple carpenter, toward the cluttered, coffee-stained foreman's shack at the edge of the site. His own expert engineers, carrying my plywood drawing, fell in step behind us. As we walked, the crowd of workers parted for us, a silent, powerful sea of respect. I glanced back one last time. Caleb was still standing there, alone in the middle of the vast, empty space, the useless Veritas report at his feet. He had become what he had always thought I was, an invisible, irrelevant man on his own job site. Frank's office was a glorious mess. It smelled of stale coffee, sawdust, and honest work. The walls were covered in faded safety posters, union calendars, and tacked-up shipping manifests. In the center of the cluttered desk, surrounded by schematics and half-empty coffee mugs, lay my plywood blueprint. It looked like an altar, and huddled around it were some of the most powerful men in the construction industry, Mr. Tanaka, Mr. Ishida, and their team of world-class engineers. And me. I was at the head of the table, a carpenter's pencil in my hand, explaining the precise fabrication sequence for the new damper assemblies. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just being heard. I was being listened to. The atmosphere wasn't tense. It was electric. It was the thrill of a complex problem meeting a beautiful solution. We were deep in a discussion about metallurgy when a figure appeared at the doorway. It was Caleb. He looked small. His expensive suit was rumpled. His face was pale and puffy, and the arrogant fire in his eyes had been extinguished, leaving behind a hollow, defeated emptiness. He didn't look at me. He looked at Mr. Tanaka. "Mr. Tanaka," he began, his voice cracking. I am profoundly sorry. My oversight was inexcusable." Mr. Tanaka looked up from the plywood, his gaze cold and pragmatic. He wasn't interested in apologies. He was interested in consequences. "Your apology is irrelevant, Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice flat. "Your father built a company on a foundation of integrity. You treated it like a plaything. You are a liability. However, for the sake of the Sterling and Son name, which my company is contractually bound to, you will not be fired." A flicker of hope appeared in Caleb's eyes, which Tanaka immediately crushed. "You will be reassigned," he continued. "Effective immediately, you are the new assistant manager of procurement and logistics. You will report directly to Mr. Franklin." He gestured to Frank, who stood by the door, his expression unreadable. "You will ensure that Mr. Vance and his crew have every material, every tool, and every piece of equipment they need the moment they ask for it. You will learn the value of this project from the ground up. You will learn what it means to support the men you once commanded. Is that understood?" The humiliation was absolute. It was a fate worse than being fired. He had to stay. He had to watch. He had to work for the very man he tried to silence and support the genius of the man he'd called a dinosaur. Caleb just nodded, a single jerky motion, turned, and walked away, a ghost in his own company. The weeks that followed were the most challenging and rewarding of my entire life. Work on the tower resumed, but everything was different. The nervous, frantic energy was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused pride. My official title was a fancy absurdity, but on the site, the guys just started calling me Chief. It wasn't a joke. It was the highest honor they could give. They'd bring me coffee in the morning, not out of obligation, but out of respect. When I walked the floors, conversations would stop, and men would wait to hear what I had to say. I wasn't the boss, like Caleb had been. I was a craftsman, and they trusted me. I'd spend hours with the young apprentices, guys who were all hands and no experience, showing them not just how to make the complex joints for the new subframes, but why they worked. I was building a tower, but I was also helping to build the next generation of builders. My days were spent in a strange new rhythm, moving between two worlds. I'd spend the mornings on the high steel with my crew, my hands feeling the pulse of the work. Then I'd spend the afternoons in Caleb's old glass office, my office now, with Tanaka's young brilliant engineers. They were turning my hand-drawn sketches on plywood into sophisticated 3D models on their powerful computers. They'd ask me questions about stress tolerances, and I'd ask them questions about software simulations. They respected my experience. I respected their technology. We were bridging a gap that was decades wide. One afternoon, a young engineer from Tokyo named Kenji called me over to his screen. On it was a perfect, glowing digital rendering of my wind baffling system. It was beautiful. "Vance-san," he said, pointing to a connection point. "Can you explain the logic of this joinery choice? The computer suggests a simpler weld, but your design is more complex." I leaned in, my calloused finger tapping the glowing screen. "The computer is thinking about strength, Kenji," I said. "I'm thinking about resilience. A building needs to be strong, yes, but it also needs to know how to bend. It needs a soul." The reconstruction was well underway, and we weren't just fixing a building. We were giving it the soul it was always meant to have. A year later, I stood on a platform at the base of the nearly completed Elysian Tower. It was the topping out ceremony, a tradition as old as the skyscrapers themselves. It's the day you hoist the final beam to the highest point of the structure. The sun was bright, the sky was a perfect, cloudless blue, and the tower, well, she was magnificent. She didn't just scrape the sky, she seemed to hold it up. The wind that had once been our enemy now seemed to play across the western face, splitting around my baffle system with a quiet, respectful whisper. The hum of fear was gone, replaced by a symphony of glass and steel standing in perfect harmony. The whole crew was there, their families too, a huge, happy crowd filled with the kind of deep, bone-weary pride that only comes from building something impossible with your own two hands. Down on the ground lay the final beam, painted white and covered in hundreds of signatures from every single person who had worked on the project. It was a time capsule of sweat and skill. Mr. Tanaka gave a short, humble speech, thanking the crew. He didn't talk about investment returns. He talked about craftsmanship. Then he turned to me. This tower stands today because of the integrity of one man who refused to let the truth be silenced. He said to the crowd, "The final signature belongs to him." He handed me a black marker. The crowd cheered, a huge rolling wave of affection and respect that washed over me and almost buckled my knees. As I walked toward the beam, I passed Caleb. He wasn't on the stage. He was in the background, quietly directing a logistics crew, a clipboard in his hand. He looked different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet competence. He caught my eye and gave me a small, genuine smile. "My father would have been proud of this building, Eli," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "He would have been proud of you." I just nodded, a silent acknowledgement. There was no anger left between us. There was no victory. There was only the building and the truth. I stood before the beam, the marker in my hand. I found a clean white space in the very center. I could have just signed my name. But instead, I drew a small, perfect compass rose, the kind you'd see on an old map, with the N pointing straight up. Then, underneath it, I simply wrote, "Evance." My work had always been about finding true north, about staying level and plumb. It felt right. The crane operator gave a thumbs up, and the giant beam began its slow, majestic ascent into the sky. An American flag and a small evergreen tree, a symbol of new beginnings, attached to its end. Everyone watched it go, their faces turned to the heavens, but I wasn't looking at the beam. I was looking at the faces of my crew. I saw the pride in Frank's eyes. I saw the excitement in the young apprentices who now knew the difference between a job and a craft. I thought about my old leather sketchbook, now sitting on a shelf in my office, its pages filled with dreams that were no longer confined to paper. And I thought about Arthur Sterling, a good man who had made one mistake. He believed my value was only in my hands. He never thought to look at the blueprint of my soul. They call it a topping out, but for me, it felt like a foundation. It was the moment I realized that the strongest structures aren't built from steel and concrete. They're built from respect. They're built by listening to the quiet voices. And they're held together by the kind of truth you can feel in your bones. A truth that, sooner or later, will always find its way into. Eli's story reminds us of a powerful truth. Our real worth isn't defined by a job title, a uniform, or the assumptions people make. As the old saying goes, true gold does not fear fire. Our value is inherent, and it doesn't diminish just because it goes unseen. However, the story's deepest lesson is knowing when that gold needs to see the light. It's about having the courage to break a silence that no longer serves you, not for revenge, but out of self-respect and responsibility. The story is a powerful reminder to trust the blueprint of our own soul and to have the wisdom to see the genius hidden in others. How did this story make you feel? Share your thoughts or a similar experience in the comments below. If it resonated with you, a like and subscribe helps us share more meaningful stories like this. Thank you for watching. May you find strength in your own truth and peace after the storm. Take care,